In the 1920s, a guy by the name of Vincent Prisnitz was one of the first people to popularize and formalize cold water therapies. He was an advocate of cold water exposure in order to boost the immune system and increase feelings of well-being. And actually, this practice dates back long before Vincent popularized it. And Wim Hof is the more recent iteration of this. First of all, some of the safety parameters. Let's establish those first. Getting into very, very cold water, 30-degree Fahrenheit or even low 40-degree Fahrenheit, can put somebody into a state of cold water shock. I mean, people can die doing that. So obviously, you want to approach this with some caution. But for most people, getting into 60-degree water or 50-degree water, or if you're acclimated and comfortable with it, 40-degree water or 45-degree water can have tremendously beneficial results on your neuromodulator systems, including dopamine. What temperature of water you can tolerate will depend on how cold water adapted you are and how familiar you are with the experience of getting into cold water. And when I say comfortable with, I should mention there is never a case in which getting into cold water does not evoke a release of epinephrine. So the feeling as if you can't catch your breath and even some physical pain at the level of the skin, that happens almost every time that you get into cold water, even if you're cold water adapted. What almost everybody knows and understands is that wall, as I like to refer to it, is coming. That's always the first experience of getting into cold water. There's no real way around that. Now, this study that I mentioned earlier, Human Physiological Responses to Immersion into Water of Different Temperatures. Really interesting study that was done and published in the the European Journal of Applied Physiology. I can provide a link to that study in the show caption. It's a really interesting study. They looked at people getting exposed to water that was warm, moderately cold, or very cold. It was 32 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Celsius. And Wim Hof is the more exposing oneself to neuroplasticity that cocaine and amphetamine do, because when you look at non-prescription, non-clinical use of those compounds as well, not only can cause a drop in baseline dopamine, but can actually put the brain into a state in which it cannot learn and modify itself to get better, at least for some period of time. In a previous episode on ADHD, I talked about the widespread use of drugs like Adderall, Ritalin, modafinil, and armodafinil, all of which lead to very large increases in dopamine, and for people with ADHD can really improve their symptoms. But of course, there's a lot of non-prescription, non-clinical use of those compounds as well. And it stands to reason that the use of those substances to increase dopamine could very well provide the same sort of blockade of neuroplasticity that cocaine and amphetamine do, because when you look at the amount of dopamine increase that's triggered by those compounds, it's really comparable. So again, a cautionary note against spiking one's dopamine too much on a regular basis unless there's a valid clinical need for doing that. So we've been focusing a lot for the last few minutes on the kind of darker side of dopamine and how getting big peaks in dopamine can be detrimental. But I want to acknowledge the truth, which is that dopamine feels great. Being in pursuit and motivated and craving things feels wonderful. And I don't want to demonize dopamine. What I'm trying to do today is to illustrate how dopamine works in your brain so that you can continue to engage in dopamine evoking activities. And certainly there is a place for ingesting things that can increase dopamine, provided that they are safe for us in the short and long term. There are activities that we can do that will give us healthy, sustained increases in dopamine, both the peaks when they happen and to maintain or even increase our baseline levels of dopamine. So how do we do that? What are some of these activities? Well, in recent years, there's been a trend toward more people doing so-called cold exposure. In part, this was popularized by Wim Hof, the so-called Iceman, getting into cold showers, taking ice baths, exposing oneself to cold water of various kinds, can in fact increase our levels of dopamine as well as the neuromodulator norepinephrine. This is not a new phenomenon. In the 1920s, a guy by the name of Vincent Prisnitz was one of the first people to popularize and formalize cold water therapies. He was an advocate of cold water exposure in order to boost the immune system and increase feelings of well-being. And actually, this practice dates back long before Vincennes popularized it. And Wim Hof is the more recent iteration of this. First of all, some of the safety parameters. Let's establish those first. Getting into very, very cold water, 30-degree Fahrenheit or even low 40-degree Fahrenheit, can put somebody into a state of cold water shock. I mean, people can die doing that. So obviously, you want to approach this with some caution. But for most people, getting into 60-degree water or 50-degree water, or if you're acclimated and comfortable with it, 40-degree water or 45-degree water can have tremendously beneficial results on your neuromodulator systems, including dopamine. What temperature of water you can tolerate will depend on how cold water adapted you are and how familiar you are with the experience of getting into cold water. And when I say comfortable with, I should mention there is never a case in which getting into cold water does not evoke a release of epinephrine. So the quickening of the breath, the widening of the eyes, the feeling as if you can't catch your breath, and even some physical pain at the level of the skin, that happens almost every time that you get into cold water, even if you're cold water adapted. What almost everybody knows and understands is that wall, as I like to refer to it, is coming. That's always the first experience of getting into cold water. There's no real way around that. Now, the study that I mentioned earlier, Human Physiological Responses to Immersion into Water of Different Temperatures. Really interesting study that was done and published in the the European Journal of Applied Physiology. I can provide a link to that study in the show caption. It's a really interesting study. They looked at people getting exposed to water that was warm, moderately cold, or very cold. It was 32 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Celsius. You can just put those online and do the conversion, or you can do the conversion to Fahrenheit if you like. But in any case, what they looked at were the concentrations of things like epinephrine and dopamine and so on. And what they found was really interesting. First of all, upon getting into cold water, the changes in adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine, were immediate and fast, and these were huge increases. So that's the getting into the cold water that everybody experiences, these huge increases in adrenaline. But then what was interesting is they observed that dopamine levels started to rise somewhat slowly and then continued to rise and reached levels as high as 2.5 times above baseline. That's a remarkably high increase. Remember, if we go back to our examples of chocolate, sex, a doubling above baseline, nicotine, 2.5 times above baseline, cocaine, the increase in dopamine from cold water exposure of this kind was comparable to what one sees from cocaine, except in this case, it wasn't a rise and crash. It was actually a sustained rise in dopamine that took a very long time, up to 3 hours, to come back down to baseline, which is really remarkable. And I think this explains some of the positive mental and physical effects that people report subjectively after doing cold water exposure. One question that many of you are probably asking is, just how cold should the water be? Well, you could mimic what was done in this study and do 14 degrees Celsius, but for some people that won't be cold enough. For some people that will be too cold. They did look at the release of stress hormones like cortisol, in addition to the release of things like epinephrine and adrenaline. And it's interesting that they noted that in all cases, but especially at that coldest temperature, there was an increase in cortisol, but that it was transient, that eventually people's cortisol, the stress hormone, subsided a bit. There are basically two different approaches to remaining in the cold when it's uncomfortable. One is to try and relax yourself, to try and practice slow breathing, to try and dilate your gaze. I've talked about this before in previous podcasts, to go into panoramic vision, to essentially try and calm yourself so that it's not as stressful in the cold. Other people, however, take the approach of trying to ramp up their level of internal autonomic arousal, meaning to get really energized and kind of lean into the friction of the cold, and they find that easier. Other people distract themselves. They recite the alphabet, or they do anything to try and distract themselves from the discomfort. To be totally honest, it does not matter for sake of dopamine release, because the dopamine release is triggered and then continues even after you get out of the cold water. Now, in this study, it was long exposure to cold water. It was an hour. That's a long period of time. And I do warn you against getting into cold water that's so cold that it will make your temperature drop and make you hyperthermic for an hour. That actually could be dangerous for a lot of people. You might have a hard time reheating, and hypothermia is not a good thing. They had people monitoring subjects in these studies and paying attention to their core body temperature. They were able to reheat them afterwards. It's well established now that getting into cold water, whether or not it's a shower, an ice bath, circulating cold water, a stream, etc., that can evoke the norepinephrine release immediately and the long arc of that dopamine release. Why would that be good? Up until now, I've basically said getting increases in dopamine are detrimental to your baseline. Well, this does appear to raise the baseline of dopamine for substantial periods of time, and most people report feeling a heightened level of calm and focus after getting out of cold water. So cold water exposure turns out to be a very potent stimulus for shifting the entire milieu, the entire environment of our brain and body, and allowing many people to feel much, much better for a substantial period of time after getting out of the ice bath or cold water of any kind than they did before. Now, you might ask how often to do this. Some people do this every day. It can be very stimulating, so typically doing it early in the day is going to be better. I don't necessarily recommend doing it right before sleep, but some people do it in the afternoon, and some people will indeed do that 7 days a week. Other people 3 days a week. Other people every once in a while. What I can say is once you become cold water adapted, once it no longer has the same impact of novelty and feeling a bit like I don't want to say a shock to your system because you don't want to go into cold water shock, but once it is comfortable for you, then it will no longer evoke this release. There really does seem to be something in the pathway from cold water exposure through the norepinephrine pathway and into the mesolimbic brainstem that causes this release in dopamine. But nonetheless, it's a basically zero cost. I mean, you need access to water of some sort, cold water, shower, etc. But basically zero cost way of triggering a long-lasting increase in dopamine without ingesting anything, no pharmacology whatsoever. Please, again, approach it with safety and caution in mind, but it is a very potent stimulus. Again, 250% rise in baseline, 2.5 times rise in baseline rivals that of cocaine, which is really remarkable. Now I'd like to talk about the positive aspects of rewards for our behavior and the negative aspects of rewards for our behavior. And from that, I will suggest a protocol by which you can achieve a better relationship to your activities and to your dopamine system. In fact, it will help tune up your dopamine system for discipline, hard work, and motivation. Hard work is hard. Generally, most people don't like working hard. Some people do, but most people work hard in order to achieve some end goal. End goals are terrific and rewards are terrific, whether or not they are monetary, social, or any kind. However, because of the way that dopamine relates to our perception of time, working hard at something for sake of a reward that comes afterward can make the hard work much more challenging and make us much less likely to lean into hard work in the future. Let me give you a couple examples by way of data and experiments. There's a classic experiment done actually at Stanford many years ago in which children in nursery school and kindergarten drew pictures. And they drew pictures because they like to draw. The researchers took kids that like to draw
I know that.
and they started giving them a reward for drawing. The reward generally was a gold star or something that a young child would find rewarding. Then they stopped giving them the gold star, and what they found is the children had a much lower tendency to draw on their own. No reward. Now, remember, this was an activity that prior to receiving a reward, the children intrinsically enjoyed and selected to do. No one was telling them to draw. What this relates to is so-called intrinsic versus extrinsic reinforcement. When we receive rewards, even if we give ourselves rewards for something, we tend to associate less pleasure with the actual activity itself that evoked the reward. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, but that's just the way that these dopaminergic circuits work. And now understanding these peaks and baselines in dopamine, which I won't review again, this should make sense. If you get a peak in dopamine from a reward, it's going to lower your baseline, and the cognitive interpretation is that you didn't really do the activity because you enjoyed the activity, you did it for the reward. Now, this doesn't mean all rewards of all kinds are bad, but it's also important to understand that dopamine controls our perception of time. When and how much dopamine we experience is the way that we carve up what we call our experience of time. When we engage in an activity, let's say school or hard work of any kind or exercise, because of the reward we are going to give ourselves or receive at the end, the trophy, the sundae, the meal, whatever it happens to be, we actually are extending the time bin over which we are analyzing or perceiving that experience. And because the reward comes at the end, we start to dissociate the neural circuits for dopamine and reward that would have normally been active during the activity. And because it all arrives at the end, over time, we have the experience of less and less pleasure from that particular activity while we're doing it. Now, this is the antithesis of growth mindset. My colleague at Stanford, Carol Dweck, as many of you know, has come up with this incredible theory and principle, and it actually goes beyond theory and principle, called growth mindset, which is this striving to be better, to be in this mindset of I'm not there yet, but striving itself is the end goal. And that, of course, delivers you to tremendous performance. It's been observed over and over and over again that people that have growth mindset, kids that have growth mindset, end up performing very well because they're focused on the effort itself. And all of us can cultivate growth mindset. The neural mechanism of cultivating growth mindset involves learning to access the rewards from effort and doing. And that's hard to do because you have to engage this prefrontal component of the mesolimbic circuit. You have to tell yourself, okay, this effort is great. This effort is pleasurable, even though you might actually be in a state of physical pain from the exercise, or I can recall this from college, just feeling like I wanted to get up from my desk, but forcing myself to study, forcing myself. What you find over time is that you can start to associate a dopamine release. You can evoke dopamine release from the friction and the challenge that you happen to be in. You completely eliminate the ability to generate those circuits and the rewarding process of being able to reward friction while in effort if you are focused only on the goal that comes at the end, because of the way that dopamine marks time. So if you say, oh, I'm going to do this very hard thing and I'm going to push and push and push and push for that end goal that comes later, not only do you enjoy the process of what you're doing less, you actually make it more painful while you're engaging in it. You make yourself less efficient at it, because if you were able to access dopamine while in effort, dopamine has all these incredible properties of increasing the amount of energy in our body and in our mind, our ability to focus by way of dopamine's conversion into epinephrine. But also, you are undermining your ability to lean back into that activity the next time. The next time you need twice as much coffee and 3 times as much loud music and 4 times as much energy drink and the social connection just to get out the door in order to do the run or to study. So what's more beneficial, in fact, can serve as a tremendous amplifier on all endeavors that you engage in, especially hard endeavors, is to not start layering in other sources of dopamine in order to get to the starting line, not layering in other sources of dopamine in order to be able to continue, but rather to subjectively start to attach the feeling of friction and effort to an internally generated reward system. And this is not meant to be vague. This is a system that exists in your mind, that exists in the minds of humans for hundreds of thousands of years, by which you're not just pursuing the things that are innately pleasurable, food, sex, warmth, water when you're thirsty. But the beauty of this mesolimbic reward pathway that I talked about earlier is that it includes the forebrain. So you can tell yourself the effort part is the good part. I know it's painful. I know this doesn't feel good, but I'm focused on this. I'm going to start to access the reward. You will find the rewards, meaning the dopamine release inside of effort, if you repeat this over and over again. And what's beautiful about it is that it starts to become reflexive for all types of effort. When we focus only on the trophy, only on the grade, only on the win as the reward, you undermine that entire process. So how do you do this? You do this in those moments of the most intense friction. You tell yourself, this is very painful, and because it's painful, it will evoke an increase in dopamine release later, meaning it will increase my baseline in dopamine. But you also have to tell yourself that in that moment, you are doing it by choice and you're doing it because you love it. And I know that sounds like lying to yourself, and in some ways it is lying to yourself, but it's lying to yourself in the context of a truth, which is that you want it to feel better. You want it to feel even pleasurable. Now, this is very far and away different from thinking about the reward that comes at the end, the hot fudge sundae for after you cross the finish line. And you can replace hot fudge sundae with whatever reward happens to be appealing to you. We revere people who are capable of doing what I'm describing. David Goggins comes to mind as a really good example. Many of you are probably familiar with David Goggins, former Navy SEAL, who essentially has made a post-military career out of explaining and sharing his process of turning the effort into the reward. There are many other examples of this too, of course. Throughout evolutionary history, there's no question that we revered people who were willing to go out and forage and hunt and gather and caretake in ways that other members of our species probably found exhausting and probably would have preferred to just put their feet up or soak them in a cool stream rather than continue to forage. The ability to access this pleasure from effort aspect of our dopaminergic circuitry is without question the most powerful aspect of dopamine and our biology of dopamine. And the beautiful thing is it's accessible to all of us. But just to highlight the things that can interfere with and prevent you from getting dopamine release from effort itself, don't spike dopamine prior to engaging in effort. And don't spike dopamine after engaging in effort. Learn to spike your dopamine from effort itself. One straightforward example of learning to attach dopamine to effort and strain as opposed to a process or a reward that naturally evokes dopamine release is so-called intermittent fasting. I know this is very popular nowadays. Some people like to do intermittent fasting, some people don't. Some people have a 12-hour feeding window every 24 hours. Some people do long fasts of 2 to 3 days even. I personally don't monitor a feeding window with a lot of precision. I tend to skip one meal a day, either breakfast or lunch, and then I eat the other 2 meals of the day, depending on which meal I skip. So it's either breakfast, lunch, and maybe a little something in the evening, or I'll skip breakfast and do lunch and dinner and so on. Many people are now eating this way, in part because many people find it easier to not eat at all than to eat a smaller portion of some food. And that has everything to do with the dopamine reward evoking properties of food. When we ingest food, or when we are about to ingest food, our dopamine levels go up. And typically when we ingest food, if it evokes some dopamine release, then we tend to want even more food. Remember, dopamine's main role is one of motivation and seeking. And what dopamine always wants more of is more dopamine, more activity or thing that evokes more dopamine release. Well, let's just look at fasting from the perspective of dopamine schedules and dopamine release and peaks and baselines. Typically, when we eat, we get dopamine release, especially when we eat after being very hungry. If you've ever gone camping or you're very, very hungry, the food tastes that much better. And that's actually because of the way that deprivation states increase the way that dopaminergic circuits work. Our perception of dopamine is heightened when the receptors for dopamine have not seen much dopamine lately. They haven't bound much dopamine. So when you fast, and then you finally eat, it evokes more dopamine release. So this is the big reward that comes at the end. Even bigger because you deprived yourself. This is true for all rewarding behaviors and activities, by the way. The longer you restrict yourself from that activity, the greater the dopamine experience when the dopamine is finally released because of an upregulation of the receptors for dopamine. But I just spent 5 minutes or more telling you that you should avoid too much reward at the end and you should actually focus on the dopamine that you can consciously evoke from the deprivation, strain, and effort. And in fact, this is what happens for many people that start doing fasting and take a liking to it. Many people say that their state of mind when they fast is clearer, that they actually start to enjoy the period of fasting. In fact, some people start pushing out their eating window or skipping entire days of eating more and more in order to get deeper into that state of mind where surely it's not just dopamine, but dopamine is released. They will track their clock. Oh, I've been fasting 12 hours, 16 hours, etc. They are starting to attach dopamine release or create dopamine release from the deprivation, not from the food reward itself. And this, I think, makes it an interesting practice and one that certainly has been practiced for centuries in different cultures and different religions of deliberately restricting food, not just to increase the rewarding properties of food itself, but also to increase the rewarding properties of deprivation. And I should emphasize that a lot of the subjective aspects of the knowledge of the benefits of fasting serve as reinforcing dopamine amplifying aspects to fasting, meaning if somebody does intermittent fasting and they are deep into their fast and they're telling themselves, oh, my blood lipid profiles are probably improving and my glucose management is probably improving, my insulin sensitivity is going up and I'm going to live longer, all these things that have some basis from animal studies and some basis or not from human studies. It's all kind of still in emerging literature, but it does seem to be pointing in that direction that fasting can encourage things like autophagy, the engulfment of dead cells and things of that sort. Well, as people tell themselves these things, they are enhancing the rewarding properties of the behavior of fasting. And so this is a salient example of where knowledge of knowledge can actually help us change these deep primitive circuits related to dopamine. And this illustrates how the forebrain, which carries knowledge and carries interpretation and rational thought, can be used to shape the very circuits that are involved in generating reward for what would otherwise just be kind of primitive behaviors, hardwired behaviors. And that's the beauty of these dopamine circuits. And that's the beauty of dopamine. It's not just attached to the more primitive behaviors of food, sex, heat, etc. It's also attached to the things that we decide are good for us and are important for us. So telling yourself that exercise or fasting or studying or listening better or any kind of behavior is good for you will actually reinforce the extent to which it is good for you at a chemical level. And a somewhat eerie example of what I just mentioned was a study that was published last year in the journal Neuron, Cell Press Journal, excellent journal, that showed that
Sure.
hearing something that reinforces one's prior beliefs actually can evoke dopamine release. So the dopamine pathway is so vulnerable to subjective interpretation that it actually makes it such that when we See something or hear something that validates a belief that we already have, that itself can increase dopamine release. Along the lines of how dopamine and dopamine schedules and our perception of things can shape the way that we experience things as pleasurable or not, there are beautiful studies mainly looking at sugar appetite and our sense of pleasure from sweet things, but also for savory foods, etc. And essentially the results that come out of this are the following. If you ingest something that you like, it tastes good to you, but then you ingest something that's even sweeter or even more savory, and then you go back to the food that you ate previously, well, you don't like it as much. And that might seem like a duh, obviously, but that shift in perception can be blocked by blocking the shift in dopamine. And so this really speaks to these peaks and valleys in dopamine that I mentioned before, and how your experience of anything is going to depend on your prior experience of other things that evoke dopamine. Big dopamine release makes it more challenging to experience more big dopamine release. So dopamine is one of those things that you don't want too high or too low for too long. It's all about staying in that dynamic range, and that's going to be different for everybody. So for the very savory foods that are now everywhere, those highly savory foods, or I think they call them highly palatable foods, are making more bland foods, whole foods, meaning foods that aren't processed, it's making those taste less good, at least for a while. And all it takes is a short period of time, even just days, 2 days or so, of not consuming any highly palatable foods. And suddenly, broccoli with just a little bit of seasoning tastes delicious to you. All right. So again, this just speaks to the fact that dopamine is this universal currency. It establishes value based on not just what you're experiencing in the moment, but what you experienced in the days and minutes before. Now that you understand how your previous level of dopamine relates to your current level of dopamine, and how your current level of dopamine will influence your future level of dopamine, it should become obvious why things like pornography, not just the accessibility of pornography, but the intensity of pornography, can negatively shape real-world romantic and sexual interactions. This is a serious concern. The discussion is happening now. The underlying neurobiological mechanisms you now understand. And this isn't to pass judgment on whether or not people like or don't like pornography. That's an ethical discussion, and it's a moral discussion that has to be decided for each individual by virtue of age, etc. But again, any activity that evokes a lot of dopamine release will make it harder to achieve the same level, and certainly the greater level of dopamine through a subsequent interaction. So yes, indeed, many people are addicted to pornography. And yes, indeed, many people who regularly indulge in pornography experience challenges in real-world romantic interactions. You now understand the mechanisms behind what I'm telling you. Now, there are circumstances in which increasing levels of dopamine is desirable and advantageous and clinically helpful. A good example of this would be the drug Wellbutrin, also called bupropion, which increases dopamine and norepinephrine. Wellbutrin bupropion was developed as an alternative treatment for depression because some people who take the so-called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which, as the name suggests, increase serotonin, suffer from serotonin-related side effects. Things like decreased appetite, decreased libido, or sometimes increased appetite, or other side effects that they don't want. And Wellbutrin seems to avoid the sexual side effects. It can blunt appetite and these sorts of things because of the increase in norepinephrine, and dopamine increases levels of motivation and craving, but also can create a state of elevated alertness that can sometimes get in the way of healthy eating and things of that sort. So one has to work with their clinician, as a psychiatrist, it is a prescription drug, in order to find the dosage of Wellbutrin that's correct for them. In addition, things like Wellbutrin bupropion can increase anxiety because of the way that dopamine and norepinephrine are stimulating and tend to place people into heightened levels of alertness. Nonetheless, many people have gained terrific relief from depression from Wellbutrin bupropion, and many of those same people had serious trouble with some of the SSRIs. So it does seem to be a very useful drug in certain contexts, both for depression and for the treatment of smoking, for people desiring to quit smoking. And of course, there are a lot of people out there who are seeking to increase their baseline levels of dopamine without taking any prescription pharmaceutical compounds. And nowadays, there exist a lot of supplements to do that. The two most common ones that are directly within the dopamine pathway are mucunapurines, which is actually a velvety bean whose contents are L-dopa. Believe it or not, the content of this bean is the precursor to dopamine. So mucunapurines is sold over the counter, at least in the United States, and it literally is the precursor to dopamine, meaning if you take it, you will experience very large increases in dopamine. Those increases are transient and very, very intense. And in fact, if you look at the constellation of effects of mucunapurines, what you find is that they're pretty striking and they look a lot like, if not identical to, L-dopa. The most obvious of those is in the context of Parkinson's disease. There are at least 5 studies that have shown that mucunapurines can reduce the symptoms of Parkinson's disease much in the same way that L-dopa can reduce the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And that shouldn't come as any surprise, given what I just told you, that mucunapurines is essentially L-dopa. It also can reduce a particular hormone called prolactin. Dopamine and prolactin tend to be in somewhat push-pull fashion. When dopamine is up, prolactin is down, and vice versa. Prolactin is involved in milk letdown in women. It's involved in setting the refractory period for sex after ejaculation in males. The reason mating can occur and then not occur after ejaculation is because of an increase in prolactin. Mucunapurines is often used to blunt prolactin, and there are actually a couple of studies showing that it can indeed do that. Mucunapurines has a number of other effects that lie in the sort of sex and reproduction pathway that are worth noting. Sperm concentration, sperm quality is actually greatly increased by mucunapurines. These are kind of curious effects until you understand a little bit more about the biology of dopamine, which I'll mention in a moment. But there are studies, 4 in fact, that describe how mucunapurines can increase sperm count, sperm quality, and sperm motility. So for those of you seeking to conceive children, mucunapurines might be an interesting choice in exploring non-prescription compounds. However, I should mention that anytime you consume a substance that increases dopamine by mimicking dopamine or acting as a direct precursor to dopamine, there's almost inevitably a crash or a reduction in the baseline in dopamine that we referred to previously. So many people who take mucunapurines feel really elevated, really motivated, really alert, all the sorts of things that one would expect from a dopaminergic drug, which mucunapurines is, and then they feel a low or a reduction in drive and excitement and enthusiasm after the drug wears off, just like they would with any other dopamine-increasing compound. For that reason, many people have turned to the use of L-tyrosine. L-tyrosine is an amino acid precursor to L-dopa, so it lies further up the dopamine synthesis pathway. And nowadays, it's very common because L-tyrosine is sold over the counter in the United States, that people will take L-tyrosine as a way to get more energized, alert, and focused. And indeed, there are data that L-tyrosine will accomplish that. L-tyrosine is typically taken in capsule form or powder form, anywhere from 500 to 750 to 1,000 milligrams. It is a potent stimulus for increasing dopamine, and the time scale for increasing dopamine is about 30 to 45 minutes after ingestion. Dopamine levels start to peak. The classic study that really nailed down the fact that tyrosine has this effect was published way back in 1983, Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, that directly compared L-tyrosine supplementation with tryptophan ingestion on plasma dopamine and serotonin, tryptophan being a precursor to serotonin. And indeed, what they found is that ingestion of L-tyrosine can increase the amount of dopamine circulating in the blood and in the brain too, of course. The tyrosine ingestion induced dopamine increases within 45 minutes, and they were short-lasting. After about 30 minutes, the effect had dissipated, meaning the levels of dopamine had dropped down to baseline, and even though they didn't look at levels of baseline dopamine past that time point, the expectation based on everything we know about dopamine biology is that it would then drop below baseline due to the depletion of the readily reservable pool of dopamine vesicles that we talked about way back at the beginning of this episode. The nice thing about this study is it does show specificity of effect because ingestion of tryptophan did not increase dopamine. Instead, it increased serotonin. So there's really specificity of these pathways that rule out any placebo-type effects. I'm not suggesting that everybody increase their dopamine levels by way of tyrosine or mecunopurines. For those of you that are seeking to increase your dopamine levels without prescription drugs, those are the most direct route to that. Of course, if you have a pre-existing dopaminergic condition, so schizophrenia or psychosis of any kind, bipolar, anxiety, things like mecunopurines and L-tyrosine will not be good for you.
No.
And if you don't, you should just understand and expect that it's going to lead to an increase in dopamine. You'll certainly feel an elevated state. For some of you, that might be agitating. For some of you, that might be really pleasurable. And then you will feel a crash afterwards. How deep is that crash will really depend on your biology and where your dopamine baseline began. So I personally am not a fan of using things like mecunopurines at all for myself for the reasons I mentioned earlier, just too intense and too much of a crash. I do use L-tyrosine from time to time for enhancing focus and motivation, but I want to emphasize from time to time. So I might use it once a week, occasionally twice a week, but I've never been one to take L-tyrosine regularly in order to focus or train or do any kind of mental work. I just don't want to rely on any exogenous substance in order to get my dopamine circuits activated. And I don't want to experience the drop in dopamine that inevitably occurs some period of time afterwards. I should also mention things that can reduce your levels of baseline dopamine. One that is rarely discussed is melatonin. I have talked before on this podcast about melatonin, why I am not a fan of using melatonin in order to enhance sleep. It can help one get to sleep, but not stay asleep. Dr. Matt Walker, sleep expert from University of California, Berkeley. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but in our discussion about melatonin on this podcast, when Matt was a guest, and in his book and on other podcasts, Matt has generally stated that the use of melatonin, except for treatment of jet lag, is generally not a good idea, and I agree. I think that melatonin is not often thought about as impacting the dopamine pathway, but there's at least one study published in 2001. First author is Nishiyama, just as it sounds. It's spelled just as it sounds. Acute effects of melatonin administration on cardiovascular autonomic regulation in healthy men. So the study wasn't specifically about dopamine, but they looked at norepinephrine and dopamine levels, and they found a statistically significant decrease in dopamine 60 minutes after melatonin administration. I've talked before about how viewing bright lights between the hours of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. has been shown in studies by Dr. Samar Hattar, David Burson, excellent circadian scientists, to reduce levels of dopamine for several days after that light exposure. So dim the lights at night. If you can, avoid exogenous melatonin, meaning if you don't have to take melatonin and you can find a better alternative, that would be a good idea if you want to maintain healthy levels of dopamine. Now, there is one compound that you are all familiar with, and you've probably actually taken without realizing it, that increases dopamine, and that's something called PEA for phenylethylamine, technically beta phenylethylamine. And PEA is found in various foods. Chocolate just happens to be one enriched in PEA, and can increase synaptic levels of dopamine. I personally take PEA from time to time as a focus and work aid in order to do intense bouts of work. Again, I don't do that too often. This might be once a week or once every 2 weeks. I might use it for training, but typically I don't. It's usually for mental work. And I will take 500 milligrams of PEA, and I'll take 300 milligrams of alpha GPC. That's something that I personally do. That's what's right for me. It's within my margins of safety for my health. Again, you have to check with your doctor and decide what's right for you. It leads to a sharp but very transient increase in dopamine that lasts about 30 to 45 minutes. And at least in my system, I found to be much more regulated and kind of even than something like L-tyrosine, and certainly much more regulated and even and lower dopamine release than something like mecunopurines. One of the lesser talked about compounds that's out there, but that's gaining popularity for increasing dopamine and as a so-called nootropic is something called huperzine A. Huperzine A is a compound sold over the counter, at least in the United States, that can increase acetylcholine transmission, a different neuromodulator entirely. But what's interesting is that huperzine A somehow, by way of interactions between the cholinergic system and the dopaminergic system, leads to increases in dopamine in the medial prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. Hippocampus, of course, being an area of the brain associated with learning and memory, and prefrontal cortex being associated with the mesolimbic pathway, decision-making, focus, etc. And so I think the reason why we're seeing an increase in popularity of companies including huperzine A and nootropic compounds is both for the cholinergic stimulating properties, but also for stimulating dopamine release. I personally have never tried huperzine A. You can go to examine.com or put huperzine A into PubMed if you'd like to search around and see some of the science behind it. Again, I'm not recommending anyone take these things. In fact, I recommend against anyone just diving in and starting to consume things without gaining knowledge about how they function and whether or not they're right for you. But nonetheless, I think in the years to come, we are going to see a lot more of L-tyrosine, PEA, phenylethylamine, and huperzine as a way of tapping into the dopaminergic and cholinergic circuits, certainly along with things like alpha-GPC, as non-prescription, short-lived, somewhat milder alternatives to things that really spike dopamine, things like Adderall, Ritalin, modafinil, armodafinil, and similar. And I can't help but share with you one more result. It's not related to pharmacology. It's related to behaviors and social interactions. And that's the very interesting and I would say important finding that was made a few years ago by my colleague Rob Malenka, who's in our Department of Psychiatry at Stanford, showing that oxytocin and social connection is actually directly stimulating the dopamine pathway. I think for many years, all of us, including me, would hear and thought that oxytocin was in the serotonergic pathway, that it was about pair bonding and it was about some of these neuromodulators that were more associated with things related to feeling good with what we have in the present moment. That's typically what we think of when we think of the opioid system or the serotonergic system. The dopamine system is really about seeking and reward. But in a paper published in 2017 in the journal Science, excellent journal, the paper is titled Gating of Social Reward by Oxytocin, in the ventral tegmental area. You now know what the ventral tegmental area is. It's that area of the mesolimbic pathway. What this paper essentially showed is that oxytocin, social connection, and pair bonding itself triggers dopamine release. And as everyone read this result, we all realized, this makes total sense, that for the evolution of our species, indeed for any species where social connections are important, it's also important to go seek social connections. And so while it's fun to think about pharmacology and underlying neural circuitry and cold water baths and all these different things related to dopamine schedules and reward mechanisms and attaching reward to effort and all the various things that we've talked about today in terms of science and tools and protocols, I'd be remiss if I didn't include description of this result and just emphasize that social connections, close social connections in particular, that evoke oxytocin release. So those are romantic type, those are parent-child type, those are friendship related, and those can even be just friends at a distance related, right? It doesn't actually require skin contact to get oxytocin release. But oxytocin release is central to stimulating the dopamine pathways. So the take-home message there is quite simple. Engage in, pursue quality, healthy social interactions. I know I've covered a lot of material today. I've really tried hard to focus on things that lie directly within the dopamine pathway and circuitries, as well as things that directly stimulate those pathways and circuitries. What I haven't talked about are all the things that indirectly serve the dopamine pathways. And out there on the internet and indeed in the scientific literature, you will find, for instance, that things like maca root can increase dopamine. Things like the gut microbiome can influence dopamine. And indeed they can, but they do that through indirect mechanisms by creating an environment, a milieu in which dopamine and dopamine circuits can flourish. Maca is a good example of that. It will reduce cortisol and through some indirect pathways related to cortisol can increase dopamine. But it's not a direct increase in dopamine. And so as a consequence, it's rather subtle compared to the various compounds and behaviors that I talked about today. Indeed, cold water exposure leads to huge increases in dopamine, as we talked about before, and very sustained ones at that. I realize in giving you a lot of information about science and mechanism, all the way from psychological and biological to circuitry and synaptic transmission, volumetric transmission, and so forth, that it might seem overwhelming. The most important thing is to understand are that these dopamine pathways really are under your control. And the locus of control resides in the fact that your previous levels of dopamine are influencing your levels of dopamine right now. And your current levels of dopamine and where you take them next will influence your dopamine levels in the next days and weeks to come. So I hope both with the mechanisms that you now have in hand, plus some of the tools to tap into the dopaminergic system, both behavioral, pharmacologic, prescription and non-prescription, et cetera, that you'll feel that you have more control over your dopamine system, and certainly that you have a better understanding of your dopamine system so that you can modulate and adjust your levels of dopamine in the ways that serve you best. If you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific way to support us. In addition, please leave us a comment or a suggestion for a guest you'd like us to interview or a topic you'd like us to cover. In addition, please subscribe to us on Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today, my guest is Dr. Andy Galpin. Dr. Galpin is a full and tenured professor in the Department of Kinesiology at California State University in Fullerton. He is also a world expert in all things exercise science and kinesiology. Today, you are going to hear what is essentially a masterclass in how to build fitness, no matter what level of fitness you happen to have. He talks about how to build endurance and the multiple types of endurance. He talks about how to build strength and hypertrophy, which is the growth of muscle fibers. So if you're seeking to get stronger or build bigger muscles or build endurance or all of those things, today you're going to learn how. You're also going to learn how to build flexibility, how to hydrate properly for exercise, and we'll also talk about nutrition and supplementation. What makes Dr. Galpin so unique is his ability to span all levels of exercise science. He has the ability to clearly communicate the sets and repetition schemes that one would want to follow, for instance, to build more strength or to build larger muscles. He also clearly describes exactly how to train if you want to build more endurance or enhance cardiovascular function. What's highly unique about Dr. Galpin and the information he teaches and the way he communicates that information is that he can take specific recommendations of how recreational exercisers or even professional athletes ought to train for their specific goals and link that to specific mechanisms, that is, the specific changes that need to occur in the nervous system and in muscle fibers, and indeed right down to the genetics of individual cells in your brain and body in order for those exercise adaptations to occur. It's truly rare to find somebody that can span so many different levels of analyses and who is able to communicate all those levels of understanding in such a clear and actionable way. Indeed, Dr. Galpin is one of just a handful of people to which I and many others look when they want to make sure that the information that they're getting about exercise is gleaned from quality peer-reviewed studies, hands-on experience with a wide variety of research subjects, meaning everyday people, all the way up to professional athletes in a wide variety of sports. So it's no surprise that he's not only one of the most knowledgeable, but also the most trusted voices in exercise science. Dr. Galpin is also an avid communicator of zero-cost-to-consumer information about exercise science. You can find him on Instagram at Dr. Andy Galpin and also on Twitter at Dr. Andy Galpin. Both places he provides terrific information about recent studies, both from his laboratory and from other laboratories, more in-depth protocols of the sort that you'll hear about today. So if you're not already following him, be sure to do so. He provides only the best information. He's extremely nuanced and precise and clear in delivering that information. I'm certain that by the end of today's conversation, you'll come away with a tremendous amount of new knowledge that you can devote to your exercise pursuits. I'm pleased to announce that I'm hosting 2 live events this May. The first live event will be hosted in Seattle, Washington on May 17th. The second live event will be hosted in Portland, Oregon on May 18th. Both are part of a lecture series entitled The Brain-Body Contract, during which I will discuss science and science-based tools for mental health, physical health, and performance. I should point out that while some of the material I'll cover will overlap with information covered here on the Huberman Lab podcast and on various social media posts, most of the information I will cover is going to be distinct from information covered on the podcast or elsewhere. So once again, it's Seattle on May 17th, Portland on May 18th. You can access tickets by going to hubermanlab.com/tour, and I hope to see you there. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumers at science.com/Huberman and use the code Huberman form the analyst .com/Huberman to get 20% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. Just use the code Huberman at checkout. And now for my discussion with Dr. Andy Galpin. Welcome, Professor Andy Galpin. It's been a long time coming. We have friends in common, but this is actually the first time we've sat down face to face.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
Yeah, there are only a handful, meaning about 3 or 4 people who I trust enough in the exercise physiology space that when they speak, I not only listen, but I modify my protocols. And you are among those 3 or 4 people. So first of all, a debt of gratitude. Thank you. You've greatly shaped the protocols that I use. And I know there's far more for me and for others to learn. So you're a professor, you teach in university, and you have a tremendous range of levels of exploration. Muscle biopsy, literally images down the microscope, all the way to training professional athletes and everything in between. So you are truly an N of one. And just to start us off, I would love to have you share with us what you think most everybody or even everybody should know about principles of strength training, principles of endurance training, and principles of, let's call it hypertrophy, power, and the other sort of categories of training. And this could be very top contour, but what do you think everybody on planet Earth should know about these categories of personal and athletic development?
Well, that's a great first question. Holy cow. I think I'll start it this way. I tend to think about, there's about 9 different adaptations you can get from exercise. Fat loss is not one of those. It is a byproduct, but that's not really what I'm getting at. And so we can kind of categorize everything like that. And what we can talk about are what are the concepts that you need to hit within each one. And then you could have infinite discussion of the different methodologies, right? And so that first thing to hit is the concepts are actually fairly few, but the methods are many, right? People have said that in iterations throughout time. So if you walk from the very beginning, the first one to think about is what we'll just call skill. So this is improving anything from, say, a golf swing to a squatting technique to running. And this is just simply moving mechanically how you want your body to move. I'm just going to globally call that skill. From there, we're going to get into speed. So this is moving as fast as possible. The next one is power. And power is a function of speed, but it's also a function of the next one, which is strength. So if you actually multiply strength by speed, you get power. And the reason I'm making this distinction, by the way, is some of these are very close, and I'm going in a specific order on purpose here. For example, power is, like I just said, it's a function of speed and strength. So if you improve speed, you've also likely improved power, but not necessarily, right? Because it could have come from the force direction either. So there's carryover. So like a lot of things that you would do for the development of strength and power, they are somewhat similar, but then there's differences, right? So things that you would do correctly for power would really not develop much strength and vice versa. So we can get into all these details later. Once you get past strength, then the next one kind of down the list is hypertrophy. This is muscle size, right? Growing muscle mass is one way to think about it. After hypertrophy, you get into these categories of, the next one is, these are all globally endurance-based issues. And the very first one is called muscular endurance. So this is your ability to do, how many push-ups can you do in 1 minute, things like that. Past muscular endurance, you're now into more of an energetic or even cardiovascular fatigue. So you've left the local muscle and you're now into the entire physiological system and its ability to produce and sustain work. And we can get into a bunch of differentiations within endurance, but just to keep it really simple right now, the very first one, think about this as, I call this anaerobic power, right? So this is your ability to produce a lot of work for, say, 30 seconds to maybe 1 minute, kind of 2 minutes like that. The next one down then is more closely aligned to what we'll call your VO2 max. So this is your ability to kind of do the same thing, but more of a time domain of, say, 3 to 12 minutes. So this is going to be a maximum heart rate, but it's going to be well past just max heart rate. Then after that, we have what I call long duration endurance. So this is your ability to sustain work. The time domain doesn't matter in terms of how fast you're going. It's how long can you sustain work. This is 30 plus minutes of no break, like that. So as just a high level overview, those are the different things you can target. And again, some of those cross over, and some are actually a little bit contrarian to the other ones. So pushing towards one is maybe going to sacrifice something else. So as an overall start, that's really what we're looking at. Within all of those, though, they do have similar concepts in terms of there is a handful of things you have got to do to make all of those things work. And we could talk about as many of those as you want, but one of them is functionally called progressive overload. So whichever one you're trying to improve at, if you want to continue to improve, you have to have some method of overload. And as you well know, you've talked about a lot, adaptation physiologically happens as a byproduct of stress. So you have to push a system. So if you continue to do, say, the exact same workout over time, you better not expect much improvement. You can keep maintenance, but you're not going to be adding additional stress. So in general, you have to have some sort of progressive overload. And we can talk in detail about what that means for each category. But this could come from adding more weights. This could come from adding more repetitions. It could come from doing it more often in the week. It could come from adding complexity to the movement. So going from, say, a partial range of motion to a full range of motion, or adding other variables. So there's a lot of different ways to progress, but you have to have some sort of movement forward. So if you have this kind of routine where you've built Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday or something, and you just do that infinitely, you're not going to get very far. So that's, I guess, the most high-level overview of all the things people can go after. And then we can go from whatever direction you want from there.
Well, I'd love to do the deep dive on each one of these
Yeah,
for several hours. And I imagine that over time we probably will. I'd love to chat about a couple of these in a bit more depth. So in terms of defining what the progressive overload variables are for these different categories, maybe we could hit the two most common combinations of these 9 things. The first one being strength and hypertrophy, and maybe we could lump power in there. Maybe not. You're the exercise physiologist,
no,
but strength and hypertrophy, which at least bear some relationship. And then maybe separately, we could explore sustained work endurance, this 30 minutes or longer continuously, because I think many people train in that regime. And probably something like VO2 max anaerobic as well, because I know that a number of people now incorporate so-called HIIT or high intensity interval training, I think with the hopes of either shortening their workouts and or gaining some additional cardiovascular benefit. So if we could start with strength and hypertrophy. I know many people want to be stronger. They want to grow larger muscles or at least maintain what they have. So what are the progressive overload principles that are most effective over time for strength and hypertrophy?
Okay. So I'll actually go a little step back. With every one of those categories I talked about, you have what we call your modifiable variables. So this is a very short list of all the things you can modify, the different variables within your workout that can be modified that will change the outcome. A fancy way of saying, if you do this differently, then you're going to get a different result. So modifiable variables. The very first one of those is called choice. So this is the exercise choice that you select. Now, one of, I'm going to go double back here. So I'm kind of doing a little bit of inception. So follow me here as I'm going up a layer to come down a couple layers. I have these fundamental laws of strength and conditioning they're kind of like a little bit of a joke, but progressive overload is one of those laws. Another one of those laws is your exercises themselves do not determine adaptations. So here's what I mean. If you're like, I want to get stronger, you can't select an exercise. That doesn't determine you getting strong. If you don't do the exercise correctly, and I'm not even referring to the technique, that of course matters, but if you don't execute it in the right fashion, then you're not going to get that adaptation. So if you choose, I want to get stronger, I'm going to do a bench press. Well, if you do the wrong set range, the wrong repetition range, the wrong speed, you won't get strength, you maybe get muscular endurance and very little strength adaptation. So the exercise selection itself is important, but it does not determine the outcome adaptation. So the very first thing that you need to think about if you're like, I want to get stronger or add muscle, is not the exercise choice, right? It is the application of the exercise. What are the sets? What are the reps? What are the rest ranges that you're using, that's going to be your primary determinant. Now, some exercises are certainly better for some adaptations. For example, a deadlift is probably not a great exercise to do for long duration endurance. Like you could theoretically do 30 straight minutes of deadlifting, but it's probably not our best choice, right? It's probably a pretty good choice for strength development, right? Because you're going to do a low repetition, high set range. You could theoretically do bicep curls for power, but probably not your best choice, right? Single joint isolation movement is not the best for developing power. You've ever done a bicep curl as fast as you possibly can, like that's not going to go well. So in theory, any exercise can produce any adaptation given the execution is performed properly. So now that we've understood that a little bit, the exercise itself does not determine the adaptation. Coming within each one of these categories, exercise choice is an important variable because it does lend you to things like what movement pattern you're in. So in other words, if you want to get stronger and you're thinking, okay, what exercise do I do? You need to think a little bit about what muscle groups do I want to use? And that's going to be leading you towards the exercise choice. For example, I want to use my quads more. Okay, fine. Maybe you're going to choose more of a front squat type of variation, a goblet squat. So the load is in front of you. If you want to emphasize maybe more of your hamstrings and glutes, you're going to maybe put a barbell on your back or do a different one. So the exercise choice is important to the prescription because it's going to determine a lot of your success. Okay, another kind of simpler way to think about this. If you're a beginner or moderate to intermediate, or maybe you don't have a coach, you probably want to hedge towards an exercise selection that is a little bit easier technically. So you maybe don't want to do a barbell back squat. It's actually a pretty complicated movement. Maybe you want to do a little bit more of, again, a goblet squat, or even use some machines or a split squat, something that's a little bit simpler because you don't have a coach, you're not a professional athlete. The likelihood of success is higher and the risk has now gone lower. So the very first variable within all of these is the exercise choice. The second one is the intensity. And that refers to, in this context, not perceived effort, like, wow, that was a really intense workout. It is quite literally either a percentage of your 1 rep at max or a percentage of your maximum heart rate or VO2 max. So for the strength-based things, you want to think about what's the percentage of the maximum weight I could lift one time. And that's what we're going to call 1 rep max. Or it's a percentage of my heart rate, right? So if I tell you to get on a bike and I want you to do intervals and I want you at 75%, I'm typically referring to 75% of your max heart rate or VO2 max or something like that. If I tell you to do squats at 75%, that means 75% of the maximum amount of weight you could lift one time or close.
In terms of determining 1 rep max, I confess I've never actually taken the 1 rep max for any exercise, but I have some internal sense of what that might be or what range it might be. Is it necessary for people to assess their 1 repetition maximum before going into these sorts of programs?
No, not at all. I think a more intuitive way is to take a repetition range. Well, you can do this a couple different ways. So there are equations you can run, and you can just Google these anywhere, and these are called conversion charts. And so it says, okay, if I did 75 pounds on my bench press and I did it 8 times, you can just run an estimate to say that, okay, you're probably going to be able to bench about 95 pounds for 1 rep max or something. So that's a very easy conversion chart. So just pick a load that you feel comfortable with, but it's kind of heavy, but not like crazy heavy, and do as many repetitions as you can with a really good technique, and then look what that number would be. So conversion
safer
charts.
than doing 1 repetition maximum.
For the general public who has, again, no coaching, it's safer. For a professional athlete, it's not any safer, but or not even a professional athlete, but a trained person with a coach. But for most people, yeah, that's a good way to go about it. You can also just kind of do it with feel, in the sense that, say you want to do a set of 5 repetitions, and you do the load, and you think, I could have done 1 or 2 more. And then you kind of have an idea of what that number is going to be. If you think, man, that last one, I had to kind of really, really, really get after it, then maybe just call that number, right? So you don't have to get overly concerned. In fact, when we start getting into these number ranges, you're going to see that they're all ranges. We're not going to give a specific 95% for one of these exact reasons. It's not that precise for most of them. In fact, some of them, like hypertrophy, have enormous ranges that you almost can't miss. So the intensity in that case doesn't even matter for the most part, because that's not the primary determinant. Some of these you're going to see intensity is the determinant, and some of these you're going to see volume is the true determinant. So Intensity, though, is the second one. Choice was the very first one, manipulatable variable. Intensity was the second one. The third one is what we call volume. And so this is just how many reps and how many sets are you doing, right? So if you're going to do 3 sets of 10, that volume would be 30, right? 5 sets of 5, that volume is 25. It's just a simple equation. How much work are you totally doing? The next one past that is called rest intervals. So this is the amount of time you're taking in between typically a set. Then from there, you have progression, which is what we started to talk about, this progressive overload. Are you increasing by weight or reps or rest intervals or complexity or whatever? So all of those things can be changed as a method of progression. And so maybe you want to go progressing from a single joint exercise like a leg extension on a machine, and you want to progress by moving to a whole body movement like a squat. That in of itself, you don't have to change the load or the reps or rest. That is a representation of progressive overload. And it's probably a pretty good place to start because number one, especially for beginners, you want to make sure that the movement pattern is correct. Don't worry about intensity. Don't worry about rep ranges or any of these things. You need to learn to move correctly, and you need to give your body some time to develop some tissue tolerance so that you're not getting overtly sore. In general, soreness is a terrible proxy for exercise quality. It's a really bad way to estimate whether it was a good or a bad workout, especially for people in that beginner to middle to moderate. In fact, even that for our professional athletes, we do not use soreness as a metric of a good workout. It's a really bad idea for a bunch of reasons. On the same token, because stress is required for adaptation, you don't want to leave at the gym and feel like, I don't really do much. Like there has to be.
What? Oh my god. You want me to do hit as well as the fucking things? Oh my god, dude. Ah. Are you kidding me? What? Are you fucking kidding me? No, I can't do that. I'm done. I'm gonna do HIIT and calisthenics.